Good afternoon, friends. I am Shankar Kumar from the Department of History at Hindu College, University of Delhi, and you all are welcome to this series of CEC Gurukul lectures. And today we shall be discussing the spread of industrial revolution. Now, industrial revolution is a term, is a phenomena, almost an event which was so transformative, not only for the place or the country where it began in the last quarter of the 18th century, that is 1780s, the decade, but it had consequences for entire Europe, and most importantly, since most of these early starters in the process of industrial revolution or industrialization, so to say, went on to acquire colonies in a distant part of the globe. Therefore, the consequence was not confined to only Europe, but it became so transformative for the entire globe, so to say. And since we as Indians have experienced the colonial period in a very direct fashion, therefore, our history all through the 19th century in particular bears a distinct stamp of the changing nature and character of what was happening in Europe, in Britain, vis-a-vis industrialization. The changing source of energy, the reaction of people, the changing politics, emergence of different pressure groups, and its consequence on the policies and acts. And if you read the history of 19th century India, we all are aware of how the fast coming industrial class, the bourgeoisie and the entrepreneurs shaped the politics of Britain, and it had its reverberation in terms of major policies even for the colonial period here in India. So, but today what we are talking about is not about India, but about Europe, and it is not the causes or the nature of the industrial revolution that we are going to discuss today. What we are going to discuss is, as you can see on your slide, the requirements of industrialization to begin with, but essentially we would be talking about, as you can see on your slide, the three waves of industrialization that Europe, so to say, experienced all through the last quarter of 18th century and subsequently the entire 19th century and the first quarter of 20th century, that is 1914 towards the beginning of the First World War. So, there are three distinct phases that we would be talking about. 1780s to 1820s is the first phase, 1840s to 1870s constitute the second phase, and 1890s till the beginning of the First World War, that is 1914, is the period that's associated with the third wave of industrialization. And before we begin these distinct moments in which industrialization happened in different pockets or areas or countries of Europe, we should be mindful of the fact that there are some basic prerequisites for industrialization to have triggered in any area, in any country, in any economy, in any pocket, and that is what we shall be beginning our discussion with. And as you can see on your slide now, there are three principal requirements for industrialization or industrial revolution. We are not talking of industrialization as in a common noun sense. We are talking of something revolutionary that had happened in the last quarter of 18th century in England, and it had some very essential prerequisites, because it was not a simple slow rhythmic industrialization that we are talking of. In fact, if you look at history of not only Europe but anywhere, you'll find that usage of technology is something that all societies and communities at different points of time did engage with, and little bit of mechanization of production process, etc., had been happening all through our historical times. But that doesn't quite earn the epithet of industrial revolution. Industrial revolution refers to something fundamental and transformative, something dramatic that had happened in England to begin with, and subsequently Europe and other parts of the world, and quite a few parts of the globe even today are undergoing this experience of industrialization. So what is the actual pith and substance of today's talk is that we need to have a historical understanding of this spread of industrialization, because at times we feel that whatever is the experience of England, or whatever was the experience of England towards the beginning of industrial revolution, is something that was replicated in other parts of Europe. That's not true. Industrialization or industrial revolution is spread to different parts of Europe at different moments, and there were regional specificities, there were corresponding change in technology and the sectors that got industrialized. And once we have a good understanding of those specificities, we won't be able to understand the process of industrial revolution in a comprehensive way. So just to do away with the kind of usual generalization that we at times tend to do in order to understand industrial revolution in terms of the experience of England in those consequential 2-3 decades, that is 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and think that the same would be replicated in other parts of Europe or anywhere where industrialization happens. That's not true. So to begin with, in a very systematic way, let's try and understand what are those 3 essential prerequisites of industrialization. What we are referring to here is power, scale, and structure. So in terms of power, what we are trying to elaborate here is the source of energy. And to begin with, industrial revolution is associated with a shift in the, it's a major shift in the usage of energy for the process of production. For example, so far Europe or England had been relying on timber, wood, etc. to extract heat, temperature, and that served as the source of energy for production purpose. Whereas here, from the time industrial revolution began, in fact Britain had started using coal much before, but it acquired a certain degree of criticality in these decades of 1870s, 1880s, and that is a shift from wood to coal, and coal became the new source of energy, and it exponentially increased the energy that could be harnessed from these hydrocarbon sources, or you can say mineral resources that lay underneath the surface of earth. And this was happening for the first time in human history, that on such scale hydrocarbon sources were resources were utilized to harness energy, and it was a very cheap source of energy. At times, to begin with, it was not very sophisticated technology, but it was cheap, and the energy extracted was enormous. So that is one. So any industrialization that happens anywhere in the world will have to demonstrate that their source of power, their source of energy is different from the animate sources of energy. So earlier animals or human beings were the ones who supplied the traction power that is so critical for any production purpose. Now it was left for steam. Now it was coal that was doing it. So that's one. Second is the scale of production. What we are meaning here is not simple mechanization resulting into increased output at a lesser input of energy, but it's again a very phenomenal increase in the scale of production. And not only that, but this scale of production is increasing also on account of change in the location of production. Locale of the production is also changing. So earlier in the putting out system, even in villages, there were areas demarcated, and some of the resources were supplied to shepherds, and they were the ones who looked after ensuring certain supply of wool or other items that they manufactured at their own place. So there is no geographical location associated with this manufacturing, but in industrial revolution we are talking about a different level of scale of production. So manufacturing should increasingly be organized in large scale units, or what we came to know as factories, and they were invariably located at places where these mineral resources were readily available, or where they could be transported cheaply, and therefore it also required people to change their location. It required mobility, it required you can say migration for human labor to leave their villages and come and settle in factories and work there for specified number of times in factories which were big, where the scale of production was many times more than the traditional mode in which manufacturing was happening. So while manufacturing was happening, or even mechanical manufacturing was happening earlier also, we are talking of a different degree altogether and a specified location where it happened, and therefore you find that industrial revolution is also associated with urbanization. These are the decades where several wonderful cities that we get to know as big cities in Britain came to have more and more population. Birmingham, Manchester, and so forth. These are the places where, or in fact, these urban centers owe its existence to industries, to what happened around 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, and the consequent human migration and so forth. Third essential requirement is in terms of structure, and what we mean by structure here is the GDP of any economy. So if we are doing it country wise or region wise, we should be mindful of the fact, and all of us know that in a very conventional terms, the economy is categorized in three parts, that is primary sector, secondary sector, and tertiary sector. Primary sector refers to agricultural production, mining, fishing, animal husbandry, and so forth, where engagement with the nature is direct, where the production is happening directly in terms of what nature has to give. And the next sector is the secondary sector or industrial sector, and that is precisely that we are talking about, where production is happening in factories through mechanized ways, using different source of energy, hydrocarbon to begin with, and subsequently nowadays production happens also with respect to uses of nuclear energy, solar energy, hydroelectricity, and so forth. So that's what we mean here. And the service sector. So what we mean here is that for any region to have undergone industrial revolution, it was necessary that the structure of its economy undergoes a transformation, and increasingly more and more value creation as a result of production is the contribution of the secondary sector or industrial sector. So there is minimization of value creation in the primary sector, that is agriculture or animal husbandry, and there is upping up of production in factories through machines using hydrocarbon sources of energy. And this shift is a big shift. This brings about a structural transformation of the economy, where value creation shifts from primary to secondary sector in a reasonably fast way. So it should not be meandering through several centuries, but it should all happen in a couple of decades or maybe 2-3 decades at a rapid pace. So if that kind of transformation is happening in the structure of the economy of any area, we do start using the epithet of industrial revolution for that area. So we shall see in our lecture today as to how different regions, different pockets of Europe underwent this transformation. And when we do that, we realize that all areas of Europe did not experience similar kind of challenges or opportunities or threats, and therefore at whatever time different areas did undergo this kind of transformation, there were different opportunities, there were different challenges, there were different political realities, and resultantly there were different sectors of economy that got industrialized. So to begin with, England, for example, industrialized with coal or cotton production, but the same does not hold true for Italy, which largely industrialized towards the third phase of industrialization, and the sectors that got industrialized during the industrialization of Italy were different from that of England. The same holds true for France, for Germany, Belgium, and several other areas that we shall be talking about in our discussion. There were several other requirements also apart from these three basic prerequisites. For example, innovation in process and technology, and new levels and types of investment, because industrialization is a capital intensive exercise, and each wave of industrialization was associated with a specific region and technology, and also the kind of capital supply. For example, we know that even while discussing theoretically the changing profile of capitalism across Europe, we find that this is the time around the middle of the 19th century we have the upsurge of finance capitalism. So capitalism was peddled by merchant activities to begin with. Subsequently, it acquired capitalism rode on the shoulders of industrial capital in say a century's time or so. And by the time we reach the middle of 19th century, it is the finance capital that became critical so far as movement of capitalism is concerned, and all that would be reflected. Their manifestations could be seen in countries and regions that got industrialized in the last quarter of the 19th century, and we shall see that through examples. So moving on and discussing the first wave of industrialization, what we need to understand here is the timeline. 1780s to 1820s is the first phase or first wave in which industrialization happened. The coverage area is Britain and France. Basically, it is Britain and France that experienced those prerequisites that we just spoke about. It is Britain and France that experienced those transformations that we just spoke about, and resultantly Britain was ahead in production of coal. Shipping sector was doing very well to begin with in Britain in these decades. Cotton production received a fillip. So these are the conventional sectors, first generation of industries where industrialization happened, where mechanization happened, where scale of production was exponential, where new form of energy in the form of coal or hydrocarbon was used for production purpose, where it is the output in these sectors that brought about transformation in the structure of British economy in terms of upping the contribution of the secondary sector or industrial sector, and consequent lowering of the contribution made by the conventional agricultural sector or primary sector. Similarly, another area or region that came under this transformation in the first phase is France. and France, as all of us know, is busy with French Revolution at around this point of time, and this I mean, historians do speak about it, that French engagement in this non-economic, or you can say political pursuit during the French Revolution and even Napoleonic Wars subsequently worked as some of the factors that brought France somewhat away from the race and pace with which Britain was forging ahead in industrialization. So it was some kind of you can say barrier, non-economic barrier for France to industrialize in its first phase. Nevertheless, France did undergo transformation, and it was ahead in woolens, silk, linen, and even iron production. And if you talk of the total gross production in these sectors, then of course France is ahead in total industrial production as compared to Britain, but in terms of per capita or per head, it was certainly behind Britain. And this is very evident because France is the most populous country at around this point of time in Europe. It was one of the largest even in territorial terms, and therefore gross figure of industrial production is high, but if you calculate it per capita or per head with reference to its population, it becomes certainly lower than that of Britain. And as I just discussed, that non-economic interruptions like the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars did put France behind in manufacturing, while Britain pervaded the market, and so it was an early beginner, and it was, and all of us know what it means to pervade a potential market in capitalist sense of the term by the first entrant, and Britain did become the first entrant into the European market and even elsewhere through its imperial presence. France was also, of course, catching up to begin with, but certainly, as we discussed about these non-economic interruptions, it was somewhat behind Britain to begin with. Now, if we feel that French Revolution or Napoleonic War entirely inhibited or retarded the process of industrial transformation of France, that's not true, because in some pockets these war-like situation or some policy measures, for example, Napoleon began the continental system where it forbade the countries under its empire to import goods from England, and as a result of this constraint, several areas which were part of Napoleonic Empire to begin with had to produce things, had to manufacture things locally, and therefore it did throw open some opportunities in several pockets, and we will discuss that, to industrialize. And therefore, or the same holds true for war situation also. For example, northern and eastern regions of France did experience notable development in industrial front, and hence this brings to the fore the need to have regional perspective in understanding the spread of industrialization rather than having a continental perspective that Europe industrializing all at once, or national perspective where we tend to see things only with respect to nation states which were the creation, subsequent creation, so far as industrialization is concerned. So several pockets and regions did you can say got sucked into the charm of getting industrialized, or they were sucked into the process of industrialization on account of several factors, and some of them could be even political. Now, you can see on your slide these are some of the examples that you can cite in order to highlight the importance or significance of having regional perspective in order to understand the process of industrialization, and these areas may not exactly be captured by national boundaries as they exist today, and therefore we find that Silesia as an area did undergo some kind of industrial transformation, particularly with reference to metal weaponry, and Saxony, Rhineland-Westphalia in Germany excelled in textile production, and all these things are happening during the Napoleonic times or immediately after the French Revolution. So, these are some of the examples of regions that experienced the first wave of industrialization, and these opportunities were thrown open due to the continental system of Napoleon that we just discussed, because they were constrained to produce on their own because they could not import it from Britain, which was the only country manufacturing these items. And for in order to safeguard the strategic interests of France or Napoleonic Empire, these things had to be produced in order to compete with Britain, and as a result industrialization did happen in these pockets. So, what we find is that there are political factors for industrialization to happen as well, and these are the examples. So, similarly, Belgium too could exhibit the right combination of the three parameters that we spoke about in the beginning, that is new technology, large scale production, structural transformation of the economy. And so, Belgium also is one of the areas or countries which experienced industrialization in its first phase itself, and therefore, it is the first generation of industries like cotton, wool, metals, which underwent industrialization to begin with in Belgium. The same does not hold true for entire Europe, and that is something that we will see, and that is something that is the advantage of having regional perspective in order to understand the process of industrialization, the way it is spread to different parts of Europe. Now, let us begin our discussion about the second wave of industrialization, and the timeline is there on your slide, 1840s to 1870s. But just as a primer to this discussion about the second wave of industrialization, let us also try and understand that it is not only about machines, production, sectors, and scale of production and so forth. You know, the response, the human response, social response, cultural response, political response generated by different areas in Europe so far as industrialization is concerned also hinged on whether the intellectual climate or whether the ideology of free market or individualism or laissez-faire, etc., had permeated that area before the advent of machine production, or machine production came first and these ideas came subsequently. So, there are quite a few instances in European history where we find that some areas in Europe industrialized first, and its you can say intellectual cosmos got transformed subsequently, whereas there were areas where intellectual climate was transforming much before the actual transformation of production, mechanized production or industrialization. So, if we are mindful of this difference in different areas, it would allow us to understand the process and response of industrialization in these areas differently and with fair degree of sensitivity, because if the ideological climate is already there within which industrialization happens, or it is a transformed ideological context in which industrialization is happening, which is liberal ideology, or which is free trade ideology, which is free market ideology, where Adam Smith has been already read, and then industrialization is happening, then it is likely to generate a different response. And similarly, there are areas where it strikes as a thunderbolt. All of a sudden it happens, and people come to terms with it subsequently with respect to the ideological trappings that followed suit. So, I just wanted to mention this in order to accord one more tangent to understand this process of industrialization in terms of several waves in which it happened in different parts of Europe at different points of time. So, the second wave of industrialization that is happening in 1840s and 1870s period, here we find industrial takeoff happening in areas like France, Germany, and also the United States of America. So, these are the areas where second wave is the period that provides opportunity for these areas to industrialize, and therefore, tone and tenor of the industrialization of the second wave would be different from that of the first wave, and we shall see how. So, while the three criteria or requirements that we spoke of towards the beginning of our lecture did remain valid, but by this time the new entrants, those areas or countries which had not industrialized, needed new tools and products to achieve the same very three criteria, or to break into the markets that that was already occupied by their predecessors. So, what I mean here is that since Britain and some parts of France had already industrialized in the first phase, therefore, the countries or areas that were industrializing in 1840s to 1870s as part of the second wave of industrialization had a challenge, and that challenge was that it was not a free open market for them to capture, because a significant portion of the market, European market, had already been captured by the early beginners, that is Britain and France, and therefore, they had a competition to begin with, and the opportunities were more restricted. And historically, we will find that the three parameters that characterized industrialization also was little bit different in terms of the usage of particular technology. For example, we know that Britain is the only country perhaps to industrialize without using a steam engine. But at around this point of time, during the second wave of industrialization, steam engine as a technology is viable and is used by these countries who are industrializing in the second phase or even the third phase, but that technology was not available to Britain, because Britain industrialized much before, and therefore, these are some of the disadvantages for Britain, because we find that while we talk about this third phase, Britain is finding it hard to come to terms with this technological transformation. It had to catch up because it was doing it on the shoulders of some other technology, while the new rage in terms of technological innovation was something else. So, what is important for us to understand is what are those new tools and what are those new products. So, as you can see on your slide, while Britain had begun with canals, with cotton spinneries and iron puddling process, etc., by the 1840s and 1850s, the new entrants, that is the areas that we just discussed, Germany, USA, France, etc., they needed railways, and railways was available to them, engineering works and steel mills. So, these are the sectors where a lot of buzz is created in the second wave of industrialization. They are the sectors that provide opportunities for value creation in the economy. So, these constituted the central innovations for the second generation of industries. So, if you map out the history of these countries, you will find that since industrialization is happening in the second phase for these countries, therefore, these countries are beginning with industrialization of these very sectors and not the traditional conventional sectors that Britain chose to industrialize. And so, second wave of industrialization, in other words, can be said to be a railway based upswing, because railway is the central technological breakthrough, and all these countries that are industrializing the second phase are increasingly making use of railway lines, and they are trying to introduce railways in their areas. Railway lines are being laid and so forth. Now, what are the advantages of railways? That is something that we need to ponder about, and you can see it on your slide. I have just tried to enumerate some of the examples, and you can say distinction associated with some of the consequences are not very good either, and that is why I have put a pun mark over there, and you can see that in the next slide. But talking about the advantages of railways, one, of course, as is very evident, it could integrate the disparate economic regions into a well articulated market. That is, the mobility on account of this transport facility, mass transport facility, is enormously increased, and different areas or under one empire or under one dynasty or under one nation state could now be integrated into a well articulated market. And when you integrate a bigger area under one market system, it becomes easy to attract capital, it becomes easy to meet the demand supply requirements, and therefore it makes a lot of economic sense. It becomes a very lucrative or attractive market destination for investors. So railways was something which was greatly preferred by the rulers to be introduced in their areas. It could also link production sites with distant raw material sources, and this is something that we as Indians are very much aware of, because if you look at the 19th century history of our country, and we track the process by which railways got introduced in India ever since 1850s, we find that much of the laying of the railway lines in the colonial period in the second half of the 19th century were not to facilitate passenger movement from one town or one area to other area. Rather, if you just plot the initial laying of railway lines, you will find that most of these railway lines were being laid in areas that connected a raw material extraction site with the ports, from where it could be shipped across the ocean on ships, because water was the cheapest source of transportation, to its imperial destination, that is England or other parts of English market. So raw materials connected with ports, and ports through ports it was taken to England. So railways is something that connected the production sites with distant raw materials, and it minimized the cost of input, and it became a great facilitator of industrialization in these pockets of Europe. Similarly, another point of charm for introducing railways in one's own empire or territory was that through railways it was possible to swiftly move the troops, and movement of troops, that is the army, was so critical to the defense system and even aggression in 19th century Europe. And we all know that 19th century Europe is full of military wars and competitive spirit that characterize the emergence of different nation states and so forth. Therefore, introduction of railways was something that was looked forward to, so far as the rulers of these countries or areas or dynasties are concerned, and they were very interested in its introduction, despite the process being very capital intensive. So since it was capital, for example, if we look at the introduction of railways in India itself, we find that railway bonds were launched with a very attractive 2%, I guess, was the rate of interest that procured to any investment, capital investment made through railway bonds, which was regarded as a good investment. So, in order to garner capital, you resort to different financial tools and apparatus, and that is something which accompanied expansion of the railways in Europe as well, and therefore we find lot of expansion of the investment banking alongside the spread of railways or laying of railway tracks in different parts of Europe, which was backed by the desire of the rulers to introduce it for their own strategic interest, as it could also swiftly move the troops. Then introduction of railways also required the support of key industries or ancillary industries or several associated technologies like engineering, iron, steel, timber, coal. So, these sectors had to develop, and in the absence of development of these sectors, it was just not possible for any country to have a very extensive railway network. And therefore, the countries that industrialized on the shoulders of expansion of railways in the second phase have a very robust industrialization or very robust sectoral presence in these areas, as we just saw: engineering, iron, steel, coal, and so they are classic heavy industries, and railways was a dominant customer of these classic heavy industries, and therefore, for any country to have railways in their area, they also needed to develop these classic heavy industries as well, because in the absence of that, it was just not viable for them to have a robust network of railways. Resultantly, even during 1840s and 50s, you could see this, that the curve of industrialization in France and Germany was coextensive with that of the railways. So, wherever railways went, that is the place where industrialization is happening, and the two could be, you can say, are not only coterminous but also coextensive. So, you track one and you get the other, you get a glimpse of the other. So, they always moved in tandem, and that maxim of togetherness of railways and heavy industries in the second phase of industrialization is something which is exemplary. And this point is something where I said that consequences did not always flow in the desired directions, and what you can see here is that the depression of 1873 to 1896 was more on account of railways rather than on account of, say, bad harvests or bad weather and so forth. So, it was mostly man created depression in the sense, and you can see why I am saying so on your slide, because railways had facilitated better connectivity between areas where agricultural production is robust and areas where urban consumers live in large numbers, where purchasing power is there. And since railways had been introduced, therefore, it was easy to integrate these two disparate areas where the gap between consumers and production sites could be reduced. So, railways had facilitated linkage of developed areas with food growing areas, and this could be seen in the case of Dakotas, Canada, Russia, Hungary. They give you examples of this, and in these areas we do witness cheapening of grain prices resulting from better connectivity, because grain prices of course in these areas went down because the input cost as a result of swift transportation from the production sites, agrarian zones was easy, and there was a reduction in the grain prices, and it is this reduced grain prices which led to general deflation. And this is something which is a new tangent to the understanding of depression, high prices, low prices and so forth. So, the maximum of prices also got a new factor now, and that is the connectivity which is triggered by railways. Improved connectivity on account of introduction of railways also meant that competition between industrial producers is becoming more intense, and countries covered by the second wave therefore coped and fared better as compared to Britain. And why? Because we have already discussed before that Britain is the only country which industrialized without using steam engine in a big way, because steam engine as a technology became viable only towards the middle of the 19th century, and by that time Britain had already industrialized using other techniques, using other. So, the grooves through which Britain industrialized was different from the grooves and arteries of railway networks through which the second generation of industrialization happened in different parts of Europe. And therefore, obviously, the early starter had to mend ways, or they find it somewhat tough to come to terms with the demands and requirements of the second wave of industrialization. And that is why the second wave of industrialized countries fared better in the competition generated as a consequence of this towards the middle of the 19th century. This brings us to the last segment of our presentation today, and that is the third wave of industrialization. And this third wave of industrialization is something in terms of area coverage you can see on your slide. It is Italy, Japan, Sweden, Austria, Russia. These are the areas that underwent industrialization in terms of the critical transformation of the three parameters that we spoke about towards the beginning of our lecture. Now, it was the third wave of industrialization that pulled up a recovery in the world price levels. So, the deflation situation that we were talking about up to the 1890s is something that is done away with. The economy was pulled out of that low price regime in terms of grain prices on account of the buzz created as a result of the third wave of industrialization. And this third wave of industrialization covered sectors like chemicals, electrical engineering, bicycles, automobiles, and so that gives you the flavor of industrialization in the third phase, how drastically different it is from the first generation of industries or even the second generation of industries. Evidently, as is very evident, you can see on your slide, they demanded more scientific content. They are more technology centric. Knowledge, idea is more central in these sectors as compared to the conventional ones where industrialization happened first in the first wave or second wave. So, knowledge or research, or you can say new ideas are more critical in the third phase, and it is in a situation where competition is very intense. So, one has to operate in a low margin context or situation, and that is where even management techniques, cost saving techniques, efficiency, these are the things which are becoming more critical in the third phase of industrialization. Now, this was very conspicuous in promoting further structural change among the second wave follower economies like France, USA and Germany, and Britain was also a very slow starter here. So, the same argument that the countries that industrialize themselves in the first and second phase are having to take some extra measures in order to compete with the third wave of industrialization, which is which has a different dynamics altogether. So, the kind of structural changes that are demonstrated by countries that industrialized in the third phase are different from the ones that industrialized in the second and first phase of industrialization. So, I'll just give you a snapshot of some kind of sectoral performance. By the early 1900s, Germany produced 80% of world's artificial dyestuffs. Now, dye stuff is a thing which is a new entrant. Now, for us, the Indians, it reminds us of the fact that chemical dyes is something which had a disastrous consequence for the indigo farmers here in India, because indigo is a natural product which is used for dyeing, and once chemical dyeing substitutes were invented and started getting manufactured at a competitive price, well, the demand, the European demand for natural dyes like indigo did suffer, and we all know about indigo revolt and so forth here in India, and you can see as to why and from where all these things are happening. By 1907, Germany was the largest producer of chemicals, and I told you that chemical sector is one of the sectors which industrialized in the third phase, and any country that is industrializing in the third phase is doing well in terms of chemical industries or chemical output and so forth. By 1913, Germany had control over half the world's trade in electrical products. So, electrical products again become critical, and Germany had taken early lead in these sectors, and therefore, in political terms, what do we find? If you read the political history of Europe, we find that it is Germany which is fast challenging the might of Britain in political terms, and that is something that triggered the First World War as well. Similarly, going beyond Germany, since we are talking the third phase of industrialization, Italy specialized in automobiles, typewriters, fertilizers. Some of the major brands, automobile brands or even typewriter brands are even today they are Italian brands, and that tells you the story about how, to begin with, Italy undertook industrialization, and right from the beginning it was through these sectors that Italy industrialized. So, there was a lot of value creation in these segments. There was a lot of R&D going in these sectors, because that is where the value is getting created. Similarly, Japan excelled in explosives. Electrical engineering, of course, with the help of the West. So, Western joint ventures, this is time when Meiji restoration is already carried out, and Japan is trying to modernize using joint ventures with Western countries. And similarly, in Hungary, we find that switchgear industry is something that is doing very well, and industrialization is triggered by such efforts in these sectors. So, the third wave of industrialization therefore did require basic industries, but their range of technology was larger than the second wave follower economies, and that is something very evident, because the sectoral presence, the sectors that industrialize in the third phase are drastically different, and I told you that it has they are more knowledge based industries, research based industries that are industrializing in the third phase, and second and first phase industrialized countries are finding it rather hard to catch up with them. Those who could did emerge triumphant and powerful, as is the case of Germany, but those who could not had a tough time. So, that is it that I wanted to discuss about in terms of the spread of industrial evolution in different parts of Europe using different technology. It happened at different points of time, and of course, it had different challenges, opportunities, and hence different flavors of industrialization that these areas witnessed all across its 19th century and early 20th century history. Thank you.